Hi, this is the first of two videos that are meant to cover the basic content of the book of James. So this video covers James 1 and 2, and then a second video will cover James 3 through 5. So let's dig right in. So the very first word in the book of James is James. Who is this James? Well, there are several Jameses in the New Testament. There were, in fact, two of Jesus' disciples who were named James. There were 12 disciples Jesus called to help him: Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, his brother John. This is James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee. This is not a good choice for the author of James, because this James is put to death in Acts 12, the first of the apostles to die. Probably didn't live long enough to write the book of James. And there are other candidates who are better. Song goes on. James's brother John, Philip, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus. So this is James the Less, James the Lesser, James the Younger. I don't know much about that James, but probably not the best choice either, although it's possible. There is, however, another James, and that is James the brother of the Lord. This is either usually, so there are some who think maybe he's a cousin of Jesus, but usually they think that because they believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary, which is a doctrine held by Roman Catholics and the Orthodox. And this is the idea that Mary continued to be a virgin not only through her childbirth, but also the rest of her life, that she never had human relations during her life. This is an unnecessary doctrine from a Protestant standpoint, because we don't see sex as in any way compromising Mary's perfection or godliness. Probably James, we should just take the word brother for what it says, because there's no reason not to, really, which would suggest that either James is a son of Joseph from an earlier wife who may have died, or, again, the most obvious way to take it, especially if there's no other extenuating circumstances, is just to take this as James, a child that Mary had after she'd given birth to Jesus. Again, don't get upset. You can't hit me. You're online. But that's what I go with, that this is a younger half-brother of Jesus. And, of course, this is the James of Acts 15, who becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church, as it were. The first of the non-disciple apostles, perhaps. Okay. And it's written to the 12 tribes scattered throughout the nations. Now, this could be either mean the 12 tribes of Israel, literally, that it's just written to Jews, or it could be implicitly bringing Gentiles into Israel, which is the reading that I favor, because the book of James doesn't really read like a partisan Jewish letter. It doesn't. It actually reads very universal. It reads as having a universal kind of audience, and it doesn't really make the kinds of sharp distinctions between Jew and Gentile that, frankly, we would expect James to make, given the book of Acts and Acts 21 and Galatians 2, which is why some have wondered if, for example, James Dunn has wondered whether the book of James is a collection of James's teaching in Greek, rather than a letter that James himself sat down and wrote. So it would be James's thinking and material. James just wouldn't be the person who sat down and wrote it. Of course, the fact that it's in Greek doesn't eliminate James, because most people spoke Greek of some sort. It was the business language of the day. However, I'll leave those for your... There are, of course, some who think that this is pseudonymous and that James didn't have anything to do with it. It is just using the authority of James to presume what he might have said to a new audience at a later time. I'll let you decide what you think on that. Of course, the easiest thing is simply to take it as being from the historical James. Okay, well, let's keep going. Trials have a formative effect. Consider it joy when you fall into trials of many kinds, because the working of trials brings patience or perseverance, which makes you mature and complete. And so, of course, our natural inclination is not to take trials as positive. But here, James suggests that trials can have a formative, positive effect on our spiritual development, on our personal development. And, of course, this is true. And James will reiterate this when we get to chapter 5 as well. So trials don't have to be considered as negative, because we can learn from trials. We can grow spiritually from trials. Ask for wisdom. If anyone lacks wisdom, let them ask of God. He gives generously. I think the context suggests that James especially has wisdom in trials in mind. If you want to have wisdom about how to endure a trial, then ask the Lord for wisdom. I think we'll see this theme also somewhat as we go throughout the book of James. We need to have undivided loyalty to God. So if you're going to ask God for wisdom to make it through a trial, you better really want it. Because God's not really into people who have a divided loyalty. Today I'm going to serve God, but maybe tomorrow I'm not. Okay, so I'm thinking about being faithful in this trial. Well, maybe I won't be faithful in this trial. So this is not talking about fleeting doubts that run through your mind or temptations that run through your mind. This is talking about a person who genuinely hasn't decided whether they're going to serve the Lord or not. And so the double-minded person is unstable in all their ways. They're like a wave driven and tossed by the wind. Let that person let that person not think that they'll receive anything from God. So we need to have an undivided loyalty to God. We also have a reversal of for the rich and the poor in verses 9 through 11. James is very hard on the rich. And there is a concept of limited good probably in the background here. The ancient world had a sense that there were only so many apples in the world. And so if one person hoarded apples, that meant that there were other people who couldn't have them. Now, modern economies don't work exactly like that. So that does give us a little bit of insight into, for example, there's an Arab proverb a few centuries after Christ that said that every rich person is either a thief or the son of a thief. So you can see that in a world where the economy is understood in terms of limited good, that if one person has more, that implies another person has less. And so, therefore, it is no surprise that when you put that kind of a situation into a Christian perspective, you come out being very negative toward wealth. And the book of James is very negative toward wealth indeed. Most of the New Testament is negative toward wealth. Another thing by the way, we seem to be having in chapter 1 anticipation of themes that will be more fully developed later on in the book of James. I'm always a little unsure when I outline the book of James, but in general, I've almost always ended up considering the whole first chapter of James as the introduction. Because the themes in chapter 1, it's like we get a taste of them, and then later on in the book, we get more details on them. And this is one, the rich and the poor. This is the first place we see it, but we will see it again at least 3 times. God doesn't tempt people. This is a very significant statement about God in verse 13 and following. God doesn't tempt people. God is not tempted. This is interesting because there are places in the Old Testament where God tempts people. Take, for example, 2 Samuel 24:1. God put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel, which was a temptation. God had told him not to do it. What's interesting is that very same event in 1 Chronicles 21:1 says that Satan put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel. That is to say, something that it is said that God does in 2 Samuel, it is said that Satan does in 1 Chronicle. And what I think this is a development of understanding of how things work, even within the pages of the Old Testament. The way I would put it is that as we move further in the revelation of the Old Testament and into the New Testament, we see a more and more precise understanding. So is God in control of everything? Yes. In that sense, can we say that God causes everything to happen? Well, in some way he does, because he signed off on it. But we know after Israel goes into captivity, first in Babylon, and then after the Persians take over, late in the Old Testament, we find this understanding of the Satan arise. So the older parts of the Old Testament don't yet understand about the Satan. Genesis never says that the serpent, for example, is the Satan. In fact, this is interesting. The very first Jewish writing that equates the serpent with Satan doesn't appear until the 1st century BC in a book called The Life of Adam and Eve. So we know that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was Satan, but the Jews in Israel did not know that the serpent was the Satan until right before the New Testament. And so there is, I believe, we tend to look at the Bible as one book from God to us, and we read all the books, all the words on the same kind of level. But once you begin to have a little historical understanding, you see that actually God has been walking with his people for thousands of years, slowly unfolding new understandings. They become more and more precise. They hit the target, as it were. I'm not saying they're in error. They're not in error. They hit the target, but they hit it more and more precisely. They get closer and closer to the bullseye as we move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and maybe even on things like the Trinity. In the first few centuries of the church, God may have clarified and made things more precise even more with regard to things like Jesus being eternally begotten of the Father and that sort of thing. And so what we find is the oldest parts of the Old Testament, they just know that God's in control of everything. But maybe the oldest parts of the Old Testament don't quite understand precisely that there is this tempter named Satan that goes around as a product tester and goes around kind of seeing if people will remain faithful. But the definitive word, this is a definitive word in James 1. This is the word. This is the final answer on this in Scripture. God doesn't tempt people. God doesn't try to get people to mess up. And that's the word right there. No matter what passage you find in the Old Testament that may sound like God tempts people, we know that more precisely that's either Satan tempting people, demons tempting people, or people being tempted by their own inner desires. So not every temptation is of the devil. Some inner temptation is from our own desires, our own lusts. But it's clear from this passage that temptation is not yet sin. It is when desire has conceived that it gives birth to sin. Jesus was tempted in every way like we were, Hebrews 4:15, but Jesus was without sin. So you don't have to have a sin nature to be tempted. Adam didn't have a sin nature, and he was tempted. Sometimes temptation comes when a good desire focuses on something, an inappropriate object. So having a sexual desire is not bad. Having a sexual desire for someone you're not married to can become a sin. And so temptation is not yet sin. As my grandfather used to say, you can't keep a bird from flying over your head, but you can keep it from making a nest in your hair. A bird flying over your head is not a sin. If you let it make a nest in your hair, that's sin, because you've dwelled on it. You've made a choice with regard to it. Sin is tied up with intentionality in James and in the New Testament. Okay, James 1 continued. We find that every perfect gift comes from above, from the Father of lights. Verse 17, every good gift is from above. God is the true giver, the true patron. The ancient world, the Mediterranean world, functioned a little bit along on patron-client relationships. You had the haves, and then you had the have-nots. And the haves often gave to the have-nots. This is the concept of grace in the ancient world. See John Barclay at Paul and the Gift. He wrote a book that wrote the book on it. So these haves would give to the have-nots. Disproportionately, the have-nots couldn't pay it back. But there are some misunderstandings we have about these, things that we say in the church that probably aren't culturally true. So, for example, there weren't any official strings attached, but there were expectations. So the person who received from the client might be expected to give honor, to praise the client. In this day and age, we name a building after a patron. Obviously, we can't pay them back for the money they give us for a building, but we can show them some honor by putting their name on the building. And so sometimes a patron would give to someone and they were expected to give honor back, maybe run errands or do some little favors. It was always disproportional. The key to grace is that it's disproportional. Grace in the ancient world doesn't mean, well, it can't be unsolicited. Grace could be solicited in the ancient world. And grace comes no strings attached. Well, sometimes grace does have expectations. For example, if the idea that God would give you salvation and then you would go around cursing him and saying what a horrible God he was, the idea that God wouldn't then cut off any future grace, does not compute. The ancient world wouldn't have had a clue what you're talking about. And so the idea that grace, that basically once God's given it to you, you can do whatever you want, sin however much you want after God's giving you the grace because it's grace, that's a faulty understanding of what grace meant in the biblical world. And so understanding patron-client relationships, see Bruce Molina, see David De Silva, some of their works help you understand a little bit about how grace worked in the ancient world. But James basically says that true perfect gifts come from above. We're tempted to look to other people for our gifts. So for example, in chapter 2 of James, we'll hear about a rich person that no doubt they're tempted to rely on them, the person you can see in front of you. And James says, don't rely on worldly people. Don't rely on earthly thinkers. Rely on God. God will come through for you. In fact, this is true in Isaiah, is it not? In Isaiah 7, where King Ahaz wants to rely on Egypt or wants to rely on Assyria, and Isaiah says, rely on God. God will take care of this. The Lord will give you a sign if you ask for it. But Ahaz wanted to depend on the thing he could see, not on God he can't see. And James says something very similar. We need to rely on God as our true patron. Don't worry about these wealthy, rich people, chapter 2, for your support. This relates to being a pastor. If you have someone who's gives a lot to your church, your budget, your pay is at stake. Do you want to tick them off by preaching something that's unpopular? This is, by the way, why Paul didn't take patronage from the church he was at. Like when he was at Corinth, he didn't take money from Corinth or resources from Corinth. He took it from maybe Philippi, which is another church that he'd already been at. But Paul didn't take support from the church he was at for this reason, I think, because he did not want to have strings attached to where he couldn't open and freely preach the gospel. Okay, be quick to listen, slow to speak. Wait for chapter 3. We're going to hear some more about that. Some people think that this is the key verse of James as well. Be what you are. This is kind of difficult to understand. James talks about looking in the mirror, going away, and forgetting what you look like. Well, what do you look like? Well, you look like somebody who's a Christian who loves other people. So if you go out there and then don't love other people, you've forgotten what you look like. Go back and look in the mirror. Go look at the royal law of love. You're a Christian, you're a lover, not a fighter. And so, that's what you should look like in the mirror. So when you go out there and deal with people, be what you are. And then, of course, the last verse of chapter 1, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is to look after orphans and widows and to keep yourself unspotted from the world. Hold that thought about being unspotted from the world. We're going to see that throughout James. And, of course, James has this strong idea of taking care of those who are powerless and are marginalized and are knocked off track by society. So more on that to come. Well, James chapter 2. James chapter 2, the first part of James chapter 2 has to do with favoritism. It mentions a rich person who comes into your church. Don't give them the better seat, and make the poor person stand or sit at their feet, this may seem a little bit strange to us, but the Free Methodist Church was actually founded because the idea of tithing really came into its own in the late 1800s. We don't realize this. We just assume, well, of course, the church has always preached tithe. But tithing really became a big thing not until the late 1800s, turn of the century, about 1900. And so a lot of churches raised money in other ways prior to that. One way was to kind of rent out pews. And so the rich would pay for their pew, and this is how the church would have its finances. Well, the Free Methodist Church, basically reading this passage, says this really is inappropriate. It's not appropriate to give out seats in the church by how special you are, how rich you are, how wealthy you are. And so the free in Free Methodist basically means you don't have to pay for your seat here. You can sit wherever you want. So don't show favoritism. By the way, Jesus is mentioned here. It is interesting, Jesus is not mentioned very much in the book of James. I can really only see two places where I think Jesus is clearly alluded to. And here it says, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ must not show favoritism, 2:1, which is, again, very interesting. And, of course, Martin Luther did not like the book of James. He called it a right strawy epistle. Didn't translate it the first time he translated the the New Testament, as I recall. Eventually, he was talked into putting it in. It wasn't just for its kind of the fact that there isn't a lot of Jesus material in James, but it's also because of what we're going to see at the end of chapter 2 of James on works. But basically, don't show favoritism. We've already talked about that. The church appears to have been experiencing some persecution from the rich. He says, are these not the ones who are exploiting you? Are these not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name to whom you belong? And what we're going to find out a little bit later in James is an allusion to the rich putting Jesus to death. And at least that's one way to take it later on in James. And so, again, in Jerusalem, who were the rich? The rich were the Sadducees, the rich Pharisees. So the religious leaders who put Jesus to death in Jerusalem, who put James to death, by the way. James was stoned to death, if I remember correctly, in about the year 62. we were in between Roman governors, and the high priest used that as an opportunity to have James put to death. And so that's here as well. So the rich individuals in mind may partially be the wealthy of Jerusalem. Love is the royal law. We find this all over the New Testament. Matthew 22, Jesus says the whole law is summed up in love your neighbor and love God. Mark says the same thing. Paul says the same thing in Romans 13. Paul says the same thing in Galatians 3. 1 John says the same thing. God is love. And here we find it in James. This is the ethic of Christianity, loving God and loving neighbor. And so love is the royal law. This is found in verse 9. Now, there's a kind of a controversial verse here in chapter 1, which basically says, whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at one point is guilty of breaking it all. Verse 10. This is a much misinterpreted verse. This verse is not saying that all sin is sin. That's not what it's saying. What this verse is saying is it's not enough to be really good at keeping one part of the law and saying, well, I'm really good at not murdering people, so I can commit all the affairs I want. What this verse is saying is you need to keep the whole law. And what is the whole law? The whole law is to love your neighbors yourself. So you may not hate your neighbor by committing adultery, but if you hate your neighbor by stealing, you still hate your neighbor. And so since the whole law is summed up in the love of your neighbor, to not love your neighbor in one way is just as bad as not loving your neighbor in another way. This verse is not talking about all sin is sin and everybody sins, and what this verse is saying is you can't let yourself off the hook in one area because you're good in another area. You're supposed to keep the whole law, which, as it turns out, is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, final comment in this verse is that mercy triumphs well, actually, in the first part of the chapter. We got a whole second part of the chapter. Sorry. I got your hopes up. Mercy triumphs over judgment. We know that God is just, and we know that God is love. But Christians tend to put one of these over the other. So I find that a lot of evangelical Christianity puts God's justice over his love. It's like, God is loving, but within the context of his justice. As long as God gets his justice taken care of, then he'll be loving. This, I don't think, is what the New Testament says. The New Testament never says God is justice, although the New Testament does say that God is just. But the New Testament does say that God is love, and we have this verse here that says that mercy triumphs over judgment. So I think any theology that is legalistic about God's justice has it topsy-turvy. That is to say, God's justice fits within the context of his love, not the other way around. Why does God administer punishment? Well, I think there are three reasons, or three factors in God's justice. One is that sometimes justice is redemptive. That is, sometimes justice is discipline, where the goal is to get us back on track. And so the goal of justice is not punishment. I'm going to make sure they get what's coming to you. I think this is a fundamental flaw in the American church right now. And that is to think of justice as punishment. God's going to get what he wants because, I'm God. That's, I think, a faulty view of God, and it permeates the American church, and it gets into our politics to where we can't even see straight. The American church is in deep dookie right now over these sorts of things. God's justice is, first of all, discipline to get us back on track when we've gone off. Second, God's justice is protective, to protect us from others. And yes, there is a justice where God lets us go and abandons us, where he says there is no more redemption for this person, and therefore God lets them go. But this idea, I'm God and I must have my punishment, even the idea of penal substitution, is therefore founded upon a faulty view of God that basically sees him as a bean counter of sin. I'm going to count out all the sin-ons, and I'm going to add them up, and I'm going to zap Jesus so I get what I have coming to me. To me, this is a faulty, heretical view of God, and we need to stop it right now in the American church, because right now we are disgracing God and corrupting and defiling his witness, and there are a whole lot of Americans right now who aren't going to be in the kingdom of God because the church has gone so far off in its understanding of the character of God. Well, James 2 begins with faith without works is dead. The demons have that much faith. And then, of course, this is the part of James that Martin Luther didn't like. Martin Luther, his big deal was justification by faith alone. But of course, Paul never says by faith alone. What Paul says is faith brings about fruit. That there's a fruit of the Spirit, that is to say. And that if we have true faith, then works will follow. Ephesians 2, 8 through 10 not only says by grace you've been saved through faith, not of works, but then it goes on to say we are his workmanship, created for good works. Paul did not see a contradiction between faith and works. And so I think we have to see some interplay between James and Paul here. The correspondence, even mentioning Abraham, the correspondence between Paul and James is too strong for there not to be some dialogue with each other. And James seems to be the one reacting to someone. And so it seems to me that the book of James is reacting to Paul. But here's the thing. I don't think it's reacting to Paul as he is. I think it's reacting to Paul, a perverted version of Paul. Paul believed that works would follow faith. In fact, Paul in 2 Corinthians 5 talks about judgment according to works. And so Paul had a role for even works in 2 Corinthians at the judgment. And so Luther went to an extreme and actually kind of skewed Paul a little in his understanding of justification by works. And so what James says here doesn't contradict Paul, although perhaps James thought he was contradicting Paul. I don't know that, but James doesn't contradict Paul. James is basically saying if you only have a head faith, and here we have to remember that the word faith can be translated in several different ways. It can be translated as a trust or confidence, which is the primary way that Paul takes it. But it can also be translated as a belief, as a head belief. And the demons have that much faith, and they're pretty scared. And so a mere head belief is not enough. That's not the faith that Paul says justifies you. It can also mean faithfulness, by the way, the word faith can. And so faith without works is dead. This doesn't contradict Paul at all. From one point of view, we are justified by the combination of our faith and our works. Don't get too upset, because this is what James says. James says, here it is, a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. The only place where the phrase faith alone is used in the New Testament is in James 2, where James says we are not justified by faith alone. And that's in verse, what verse is it? If I don't find it in 3 seconds, I will move on. Verse 24. And so from one perspective, what we would say as Protestants is that it's not the works that justify us. It's the faith that justifies us. But if we have true faith, then the works will follow. And so we are not just justified by our faith, but we are also justified in one sense from the things that follow. Again, I don't think that James and Paul are disagreeing with each other. I just think that they're giving us two different sides to the same basic story. And again, I surely think there's some interaction between James and Paul here. So I don't think that James is the first writing written. I think James is reacting to Paul, which means that Galatians and Romans need to have been written before James could write this, which to me says that this must have been written in the final days of James's life, or perhaps, as James Dunn has suggested, this is a collection of Jamesian teaching. So this concludes James 2. Well, I got a little riled up there. And of course, the Lord will decide where He takes His church. But the book of James has some very, very timely things to say for such a time as this.